Hello and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Please sign up at my Patreon to get episodes earlier, bonuses, to have a say on future content, and to interact with me and other Warbirders directly. But mainly you'll have the satisfaction of helping keep this podcast going. You can also toss me a tip via PayPal at WOWB17, or even just drop me a review. Thank you for your support. Now on to the show. Hello, Warbirders. Firstly, I'd like to welcome John Calvert and Caleb to the Patreon family. One of the cool things about Patreon is the community that we've built there with a running group chat on all things Warbird. Why don't you come over and join Evan, Matt, Tracy, Harrison, Stefan, Luke, and the others as we blab away about our favorite birds. Now, often I start these episodes with where the idea came from. Sometimes it's from a listener's suggestion. Sometimes it's a follow-up from a previous episode. Sometimes it's an update or a replacement for an earlier Warbird. And sometimes the spirit has just moved me to take a shine to this particular bird. With the Invader, it's all of those reasons. It all started when longtime listener Dale Longmire requested the Douglas A or B-26 Invader. But then I realized that there might be confusion with the Martin B-26 Marauder, as the Invader had been named both A-26 and B-26, amongst other things, as we shall see, over its long lifespan. Now, as the Marauder came first historically, I decided to tackle it first. Give it a listen if you haven't. So there's a suggestion and a follow-up. Then, I wrapped up my Douglas A-20 Havoc episode with, open quotes, the US AAF used Havocs in Europe for Overlord support, before switching to the Douglas A-26 Invader, which I guess could be seen as the Havoc's kid sister, close quotes. So that sets us up for a replacement type episode. And lastly, I've always had a fancy for this Warbird, ever since my parents gave me a Warbird coffee table type book filled with glossy pics of gunfighters and bomb haulers. Even as a kid, I thought that for what it was designed to do, the Invader just looked right. I don't know any other way to describe it, and judging by its wide and long career, I think I was right. Okay, enough preamble, and if you skipped over it, well, welcome back. Let's dive in. So, what would become the Invader wasn't just an updated Havoc. It was a clean sheet design, built on the operational experience of the A-20, aiming to create a more versatile, survivable, and powerful attack aircraft. The team doing the designing wasn't even the same. Yes, Ed Heineman was still the lead designer. Just to recap his career, he was a self-taught engineer who worked at Douglas for decades, churning out classics such as the SBD Dauntless, the A-1 Skyraider, and A-3 Skywarrior. At one point, Heineman told someone that his approach to aircraft design was simple. Take the most powerful engine available and design an aircraft around it. But the team also included Ted R. Smith, who had worked on earlier Douglas projects, such as the B-18 Bolo, B-23 Dragon, and yes, the A-20 Havoc. Apollo Milton Olin Smith, usually referred to as AMO Smith, was responsible for the laminar flow airfoil wing and aerodynamics of the A-26, and what an expert in that field he was. Interestingly enough, he was drafted away from Douglas for a time in October 1942 from none other than General Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, to help organize and develop the newly formed Aerojet Company as its first chief engineer. Now, I'd never heard of Aerojet before, but they did everything from designing JATO rockets to the engines in the AIM family of missiles that are even used today. So it was a very solid team that set to work to improve on the Havoc, a plane that was, let's be honest, pretty damn good to begin with. So, as per Heinemann's dictum, they started off with the two most powerful engines available at the time, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasps, the same family of power plants that drove the Grumman F6F Hellcat, the Republic P47 Thunderbolt, and the Vought F4U Corsair, and yes, they built a plane around it. Each twin-row 18-cylinder air-cooled radial had a displacement of 2,800 cubic inches. That's 46 liters. For comparison, my mid-size SUV has a displacement of 4 liters. Depending on the submodel, they could generate between 2,100 and 2,800 horsepower each. Around it, they built a slightly bigger and heavier aircraft than the A-20. It was going to be 3 feet longer, 1 foot taller, and have 9 more feet on the wingspan. But it would be more aerodynamic with reduced drag and improving performance at higher speeds. Especially as the wings were actually smaller in area, even though the empty weight of the aircraft would be 4,000 pounds more than the A-20. The Invader and her older sister, the Havoc, were both very economical in crew, if you think about it. The B-25 was also used in the ground attack role, especially in the Pacific, and had 6 or more crew. The A-20 and 26 got away with 3 and sometimes just 2. Of course, there was the pilot who occupied the left seat, and the other crew member either worked as a navigator and gun loader for the nose guns, or in some versions, that crew member served as a navigator and bombardier and could access the nose section to do the bomb aiming. Normally, he sat next to the pilot, but he could access the nose through the lower section of the right instrument panel, which we are more used to seeing with RAF types such as the Lancaster, the Blenheim, Beaufort, Wellington, etc. There was a jump seat behind them. To access the aircraft, the pilot or pilots entered from the canopy above their seats. The first canopy design had a heavy frame and a single door on the right side, and had limited visibility and was a challenge to exit. The canopy was changed after about 800 production aircraft to a clamshell style with greatly improved visibility. The rear gunner had a door on the right side of the fuselage. The bombardier had a bottom hatch which could be jettisoned. The gunner occupied his compartment, which was located aft of the bomb bay on the dorsal surface. He aimed and fired both of the remote-controlled dorsal and ventral gun turrets via an interesting system. The gunner sat facing aft, peering into a binocular-style periscope mounted on a central column. He controlled the guns using a set of handles on either side of the column and aimed primarily above the aircraft's centerline. At the heart of the system was a clever flipping mirror. As the gunner tracked a target and moved the handles downward, the mirror would automatically flip at the midpoint, supposedly smoothly switching his view from the upper periscope to the lower one, without any obvious break in the sight picture. At least that was the idea. The guns themselves followed wherever the periscope was pointing, seamlessly tracking of between the upper and lower turrets while accounting for things like parallax and geometry. Just to explain parallax, it is the apparent shift in the position of an object when it's viewed from different angles. In aviation gunnery, it refers to the difference between the line of sight from the gunner's aiming device, like the periscope or a sight, and the actual line of fire of the guns. Because the sight and the guns are in physically different locations, the system has to account for that offset to ensure that where the gunner thinks he's aiming at is where the bullets will actually go. If uncorrected, parallax can cause shots to miss the target even when the aiming looks perfect. On paper, this system was an elegant and futuristic solution. In practice, however, the engineers spent far too much time to make it work reliably, and it delayed production. Once in service, the system proved to be overly complex and notoriously finicky in the field. As you can imagine, with all the optics and mirrors that need to flip perfectly, something that frontline crews did not really appreciate. One advantage over the Havoc was that all three members could access each other. In the Havoc, there was no access between the three crew positions, so if somebody got wounded, they were on their own. In the Invader, the cockpit and nose were no problem to reach. To get to the gunner's compartment, though, the access was via the bomb bay and was possible only if that was empty. So that might cause a dilemma. If your gunner is bleeding out, do you dump the payload and help him, or press on? The Invader was built to be versatile. Now, I know we throw that word around a lot, but in the Invader, it was baked in. In a 1945 issue of Popular Science was an article on the Invader, and it was titled "The Plane of Many Faces," and this shows just how deliberate the versatility was incorporated. There were originally 6 different kinds of noses available. And here we have to adjust our thinking a little. Yes, we've heard many times about different versions of an aircraft, like the P-38 and the B-25 had different nose types depending on the job. But in this case, the noses were changeable. The idea was that you would have the different nose sections in the hangar, and depending on the need, you could change them. Need a level bomber? Put on the glass nose with the Norden bomb sight for the bombardier to operate. Need a ground attack plane tomorrow? Swap out the glass one for the solid one with lots of guns. Plane of many faces indeed. The nose was designed to come off with the removal of just 6 bolts and the unplugging of electrical cables. With a crane and a few hours, the idea was to have a different plane for a different need. I don't have any information as to how often this nose swapping feature was actually used. And there were plans for a wide assortment of solid noses. One with 2 50 caliber machine guns and a 75mm cannon, or another with 2 50 calibers and a smaller 37mm cannon, or another with a 75mm and a 37mm cannon, or 4 50 calibers and a 37mm cannon, or lastly, one with 2 37mm cannons side by side. In the end, all these different options were not exercised, and the type settled down into 2 main variants. The A-26B was the gunship and usually packed 6 or 8 50 caliber machine guns, known as the all-purpose nose, the 6-gun nose, or the 8-gun nose. The A-26C sported the glass or bombardier nose, with the Norden bomb sight for medium-altitude precision bombing. Initially, the A-26C nose section also included 2 fixed guns, but those were eliminated after underwing gun packs in the wings were added. The prototype, XA-26, first flew on the 10th of July 1942. Flight tests were good, with excellent performance and handling, but some tinkering needed to be done to the cowlings and propeller spinners in order to sort out some engine cooling problems. Also, the nose wheel structure needed to be beefed up, but it was pretty good for a fresh new design. I'm sorry, I know you've heard me rave many times about how fast things went in wartime, but I'm going to do it again. The prototype first flew in July, and Douglas delivered the first production aircraft to the US AAF in September. Yes, that same year. These went right away for field evaluation in actual combat with the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific Theater. And from what I've said up until now, you'd think that the reports back from the field would be glowing, but they weren't. The A-26 Invader made its combat debut when 4 aircraft from the 13th Squadron of the 3rd Bombardment Group, nicknamed the Grim Reapers, carried out bombing runs on Japanese-held islands near Manokwari. During these initial missions, the crews quickly noticed the severely limited downward visibility from the cockpit. This made the aircraft poorly suited for close support and ground attack roles, which were supposed to be its specialty. General George Kenney, head of the Far East Air Forces, didn't mince words. He flatly rejected the A-26, saying he didn't want it replacing anything in his inventory. Despite this rocky start, development of the aircraft continued, and as I mentioned before, the canopy was redesigned to help with the visibility. What must have hurt the designers and builders of the Invader was that the 3rd Bomb Group specifically asked for more A-20 Havocs instead. Gee, was this thing turning into a short-lived dud? A-26s were also sent to Europe and were assigned to the 9th Air Force. 18 aircraft and crews were assigned to the 553rd Squadron of the 386 Bomb Group, and they flew their first mission on the 6th of September 1944. On the 8 test missions, not one aircraft was lost, and the 9th Air Force announced that they were very happy, and they began replacing their frontline A-20s and B-26s with the new A-26 Invader. I do find it interesting that the European and Pacific theaters had different preferences for aircraft. We've seen it a few times, most notably in the P-38, where the European users did not love it, while the Pacific Air Forces did. Here was the reverse. In Europe, they loved the Invader and just couldn't get enough of the A-26C, the one with the glass nose. So they were obliged to fly with mixed units of Havoc and Invaders until production caught up. Well, they were sister aircraft. Together they performed bombing and strafing missions as well as tactical reconnaissance and night interdiction work. In January 1945, the 47th Bomb Group of the 12th Air Force in Italy began operating the A-26. These aircraft were put to work targeting German supply routes and were also used in direct support roles, disrupting enemy armor and troop movements, particularly during the final push through the Po Valley in the closing stages of the Italian campaign. And then the war ended, and most invaders were scrapped, and some were used as target practice, and none remain as survivors. Just joking. We're not done. Not by a long shot. But what was done was the production run of the Invader, which ended in September 1945. But 2,452 had already been produced, and a lot of them were still in service. And this is where the naming conventions start to get tricky. The US AAF continued operating the Invader following the war, but after the United States Air Force, USAF, became a separate branch in 1947, it redesignated this aircraft as the B-26. Well, the Marauder had been retired, but was known in Strategic Air Command as the RB-26 reconnaissance aircraft, which operated from 1949 to 1950. In Europe, U.S. Air Forces continued flying the B-26 until 1957. Meanwhile, Tactical Air Command used the aircraft under both the B-26 and later A-26 designations. The final version, known as the B-26K, was reclassified again as the A-26A in 1966, and we'll explain later. This updated model remained in use with active duty special operations into the late 1960s, and with Air National Guard Special Ops units until 1972. The U.S. Navy even got in on the action, obtaining Invaders from the USAF for target towing and general utility until replaced by the DC-130A variant of the C-130 Hercules. The Navy called them JD-1s. Before we move on to Korea, I'd like to remind you to please share this podcast with someone who might like it. Also, I'd love you to join Patreon. Some listeners were sad that they didn't get all of the last episode on the Beechcraft XA-38 Grizzly, but as I always say, there are advantages to being a patron. You can also toss me a tip via PayPal at WOWB17, or even just give me a good review. It all helps, and I appreciate it more than you know. When the Korean War broke out on the 25th of June 1950, the Invader may not have been the newest plane in the inventory, but it sure got into the fight darn quickly 2 days after, when B-26 Invaders from the 3rd Bombardment Group, flying out of southern Japan, were among the earliest USAF aircraft to see action in Korea. They conducted missions over South Korea on June 27 and 28, 1950, and on June 29th carried out the USAF's first bombing raid on North Korea, targeting an airfield near Pyongyang. In August of 1950, the Air Force Reserve's 452nd Bombardment Wing was activated for Korean service, and by October, the first units of the 452nd Bombardment Wing departed George Air Force Base for Itazuki Air Base in Kyushu, Japan. Its 731st Bomb Squadron, trained for night missions, was detached to the 3rd Bomb Wing at Iwakuni Air Base on Honshu. The 452nd's first B-26 arrived on 25th of October, and the wing flew its first combat interdiction mission just 2 days later, only 77 days after being recalled to service. On the 31st of October, the unit experienced its first aerial engagement. 3 Yak fighters attacked the B-26s. The B-26s shot down 1 Yak, while F-51 twin Mustangs arrived in time to eliminate the other 2. Initially, the 452nd was the only B-26 unit flying daytime missions in the Korean War, providing close air support and attacking enemy airfields, bridges, and supply routes. These efforts peaked in February 1951. The unit moved to Mihao Air Base on the 10th of December 1950 and soon suffered its first combat losses. 4 B-26s and their crews were lost, although only 1 fell to enemy fire. Flying conditions in Korea were tough. The other 3 were lost due to accidents, a power line collision, a crash in a snowstorm, and a dive into water after breaking out of overcast too low. 1 aircraft was shot down near Sucheon. The good news was that its 3 crew members parachuted to safety. The bad news was that they were executed after capture. During the enemy's spring offensive in April 1951, the 452nd dramatically increased its sortie rate to 30 to 36 missions per day, despite having only 18 operational aircraft. The intense schedule strained both air crews and maintenance teams. Over 8 days, the wing suffered the loss of 3 B-26s behind enemy lines and heavy damage to several others. Although the B-26 proved highly effective at low-level attacks with bombs, rockets, and guns, crews struggled with the tight terrain of Korean valleys, which exposed them to concentrated ground fire. This forced a shift to medium-altitude bombing. Despite these challenges, the wing earned a second Distinguished Unit Citation for operations from July 1951 to April 1952. The only B-26 wing to be so recognized during the war. President Syngman Rhee awarded the wing the Korean Presidential Unit Citation, and the unit was credited with participation in 8 campaigns. John Springer Walmsley Jr. was born in Baltimore, Maryland, USA on January 7, 1920. Walmsley joined the Army Air Forces during World War II and did valuable work as an instructor pilot in the States, and later in Japan, but he did not see combat. Accounts described him as being cheerful and popular, and his online photos sure show that. Think of a tow-headed all-American boy in a USAF uniform or flight gear, and that's what he looks like. In June 1951, Walmsley was deployed to the 8th Bombardment Squadron, 3rd Bombardment Wing in Korea. During that time, the two sides of the conflict were in negotiations towards a truce. However, as the negotiations dragged on, it appeared that North Korean and Chinese troops were hastening the movement of supplies to the front lines at night, even as negotiations were taking place. The move caused the United Nations, UN forces, to begin with Operation Strangle, an air pressure strategy to put political pressure on the North Korean leaders. Operation Strangle was to be a new interdiction campaign designed to attack supply lines using arc lights, which were bright lamps attached to the bottom of the B-26 aircraft, which would spot truck convoys moving at night. The 80 million candle power arc lights would easily light up the North Korean supply trains, but anyone see a problem here? Yes, this giant light in the sky would make a pretty obvious target for anti-aircraft fire. So the North Korean and Chinese trains were soon equipped with copious guns, and the valleys through which they traveled were bristling with anti-air capability. But somebody had to do the job, and Walmsley was one of the first pilots to volunteer for these dangerous missions. By September 14, now Captain John S. Walmsley Jr. had done 20 of these dangerous missions. And he took off from Kusan Air Base in his B-26 Invader, call sign Skillful 13, on a night mission to locate more truck convoys. Aboard was also Second Lieutenant William D. Mulkins, the bombardier navigator, and Captain William W. Browning, photomapper, and Master Sergeant George Moorer, gunner. As they approached Yangdok, roughly 100 miles behind enemy lines, the crew spotted a supply train moving south under the cover of darkness. Walmsley immediately ordered an attack. The crew dropped all their bombs, damaging the train but failing to stop it. Walmsley then requested another B-26 to assist and offered to illuminate the target with his aircraft's powerful searchlight. Despite coming under intense anti-aircraft fire from the train and surrounding defenses, Walmsley made 3 low passes, keeping his searchlight fixed on the target to aid the second bomber's attack. By absorbing the brunt of enemy fire, his aircraft shielded the second B-26, enabling it to successfully destroy the train and its cargo. On the third pass, Walmsley's aircraft was critically damaged. Its fuel tanks were ruptured, leading to a fire. Despite his efforts to keep the airplane aloft, it crashed in mountainous terrain after flying roughly 2 more miles. Walmsley, Mulkins, and Browning were killed, while Moorer survived but was captured and spent the rest of the war as a POW. For their bravery, the entire crew received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Walmsley was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor on June 12, 1954. His widow accepted the medal at the ceremony at Ballings Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. Just weeks later, both the use of arc light searchlights and the broader Operation Strangled were discontinued, as commanders determined the tactical risks outweighed the gains. Overall, during the Korean War, B-26s were credited with the destruction of a copious number of targets, including 38,500 vehicles, 406 locomotives, and 7 enemy aircraft on the ground. Interestingly, Invaders were some of the first aircraft involved in the Korean fight, and they were also the last. carrying out the very last USAF bombing mission of the war, just 26 minutes before the armistice agreement was signed on the 27th of July, 1953. And now the B-26s could retire from military service and do firefighting or photo flights or whatever, right? Nope. The Invader was one hell of a workhorse. And if they couldn't fight with an official air force, they were perfectly content to fight with, unofficial air forces? The first use of the Invader in a covert activity that I could find was the CIA-run Operation Hike in 1958 in Indonesia. The CIA, of course, being the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. Concerned about Indonesian President Sukarno's communist sympathies, the CIA started Operation Hike in an attempt to topple his government, which was known by the super suspicious name Guided Democracy in Indonesia regime. The secret black operation sent about a dozen B-26 invaders in order to help support rebel forces. One of their pilots was Alan Lawrence Pope, and I think his story would make one hell of an interesting movie or TV series, so I'm going to share some of it with you. Pope was born in Miami, Florida on October 20th, 1928. Graduated from the University of Florida, and then enlisted in the U.S. Air Force and served as a first lieutenant in the Korean War. During that conflict, he flew the B-26 Invader in combat and received 3 air medals and a Distinguished Flying Cross. Following Korea, Pope returned to the United States and worked as an Air Force instructor. But maybe that was a little too pedestrian for him, because in March 1954, Pope left the Air Force and joined the Civil Air Transport Company, CAT. Sounds legit, right? Well, CAT was a subsidiary of the Airedale Corporation, which was a private Delaware company run by the CIA. So Pope was engaged by CAT in flying a Fairchild C-119 flying boxcar to supply French forces who were struggling and besieged in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in French Indochina. Pope was the co-pilot of the lead aircraft in a group of 6 C-119s that made the very last airdrop to the besieged garrison on May 6, 1954. Just one day before the French force surrendered. Pope stayed on with CAT for the next 4 years, making civilian charter flights from Taiwan and later from Saigon. I wonder if he was bored. Well, he wouldn't be soon. In April 1958, Pope was sent from Saigon to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, where he was assigned a familiar friend, a B-26 Invader. One major difference, though, it had been painted black and had its markings obscured. Ooh, shady. For the next month, Pope flew his shady B-26, assisted by a rebel co-pilot, and raised hell in the previously mentioned Operation Hike, which was trying to topple that communist-leaning Indonesian president, Sukarno. Pope bombed at least 3 merchant ships. He attacked the Air Force bases with 500-pound bombs and machine gun fire, damaging or destroying a Douglas C-47 Skytrain, a North American P-51 Mustang, and destroying a consolidated PBY Catalina. And he shot up gunboats. It was all fun and games until the Indonesian Air Force managed to scramble their one still serviceable P-51 Mustang, which was located at Liang Air Base, when Pope attacked it on May 18, 1958. The P-51, flown by Ignatius Dewanto, closed on the B-26 just as Pope was attacking. Dewanto hit the B-26, damaging its starboard wing, and the bomber caught fire. Pope and the rebel radio operator hit the silk, although Pope fractured his right leg getting out. He was captured by government forces. Now, this was a bit of a diplomatic pickle. The U.S. tried to distance itself from Pope, with the U.S. ambassador to Indonesia calling Pope a paid soldier of fortune with no connection to the government. However, Pope had been captured with a bunch of incriminating documents, including his logbook that proved that the USA was plenty involved. And this put the Eisenhower administration into a very embarrassing situation. Indonesia rejected Pope's plea to be considered a prisoner of war, and he was charged with the killing of 17 members of Indonesia's armed forces and 6 civilians and sent to trial. On April 29, 1960, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. But hold on. Some people just seem to have 9 lives, and Pope was one of them. Indonesia seems like they didn't really want to do it, and after a bunch of appeals for Pope's release by Pope's wife, mother, and sister, and U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, who also threw in 10 C-130 Hercules planes to sweeten the deal, he was allowed to just leave the country in July 1962. Before Pope left the country, President Sukarno told him, "I want no propaganda about it. Now go. Lose yourself in the USA secretly. Don't show yourself publicity. Don't give out news stories. Don't issue statements. Just go home. Hide yourself, get lost, and we'll forget the whole thing." Did he lose himself? Well, yes and no. He joined Southern Air Transport, SAT. And like CAT, SAT was also a CIA-run outfit. Also flying covert missions in regions including Southeast Asia, so he kinda got lost, but kinda not. But in December 1960s, more B-26s began arriving in Southeast Asia and set up at Takli Royal Thai Air Force Base, Thailand. Again, these were unmarked aircraft operated by the US CIA, and they were there for Operation Millpond. Their mission was assisting the Royal Lao government in fighting the Pathet Lao, or the Lao People's Liberation Army, which was a communist political movement. No actual combat missions are known to have been flown, although they operated over Laos until the end of 1961. Part of this gun-shy behavior was the fallout from a little brouhaha known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. We'll talk about that one in a minute. But these B-26s ended up being transferred to Bien Hao Air Base, South Vietnam, in October 1961 as part of Operation Farmgate, which was one of the shadowy pre-Vietnam War actions where U.S. forces were not supposed to be involved but were kind of involved. Ostensibly, the mission was to train the Republic of Vietnam Air Force using T-28 Trojans, C-47 Skytrains, and yes, B-26 Invaders. This policy led to some funny but not so funny situations where enlisted South Vietnamese men were brought along and flown into combat by American pilots after having been told not to touch anything in the cockpit. If they were forced down, then having a Vietnamese service member on board could prove that it had just been a training flight. Before we get too deep into Vietnam, I had promised a look at the B-26's actions in Cuba. In early 1961, around 20 B-26 aircraft were modified and sanitized at Duke Field, Auxiliary Field 3 at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida. Their defensive guns were removed and they were fitted with 8 gun noses, underwing drop tanks, and rocket launchers. These aircraft were then flown to a CIA-controlled base in Guatemala, where Cuban exiled air crews were being trained on the B-26s, C-46s, and C-54s, with assistance from the Alabama Air National Guard. In April 1961, the aircraft were moved to Nicaragua and repainted with the insignia of Cuba's official air force, the Fuerza Aérea Revolucionaria, or FAR, to create a cover story. On the 15th of April, 8 B-26s flown by Cuban exiles and now operating under the banner of the Fuerza Aérea de Liberación, or FAL, struck 3 Cuban airfields in an attempt to destroy FAR aircraft on the ground. On the 17th of April, these aircraft provided air support for the Bay of Pigs invasion, but the mission ultimately failed. The fighting ended on the 19th of April with the loss of 9 FAL B-26s, 10 Cuban exile airmen, and 4 American airmen. Ironically, Cuba's own B-26s were also used during the battle. Later, some of the same CIA-affiliated pilots who had flown in the Bay of Pigs operation were recruited to fly in the Congo crisis, another counterinsurgency. Invaders were also used by the Portuguese Air Force in Portuguese Angola in 1965 during the Portuguese Colonial War, and 2 flew in the Nigerian Civil War in 1967. So by the time the 60s rolled around, the type was pushing 20 years old. But with the wars in Southeast Asia heating up, there seemed to be plenty of counterinsurgency and special operations work to be done. But the Invader needed a little love, as was shown by an incident on the 11th of February 1964. 2 pilots died in the crash of a B-26 on the gunnery range at England Air Force Base when it lost a wing during a pullout from a demonstration strafing pass. B-26 aircraft used by USAF commandos in Vietnam were grounded on the 8th of April 1964 following an investigation into the 11th of February incident. B-26 aircraft in use by the South Vietnamese Air Force were also grounded. The On-Mark Engineering Company was commissioned and began work to adapt the aircraft for modern counterinsurgency and special operations missions. Structural upgrades included reinforced wings with new wing tip fuel tanks, landing gear and brakes, and more powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 103W radials, paired with 4-bladed reversible Hamilton standard propellers for improved performance at low altitudes. The cockpit was modernized with updated avionics, radios, and a new gun sight. And while the aircraft retained the signature 850 caliber nose guns, it gained 6 underwing hardpoints, capable of carrying up to 8,000 pounds of ordnance, including rockets, bombs, napalm, and auxiliary fuel tanks. Although designated the B-26K and known as the Counter-Invader by the Air Force, the aircraft was reclassified as the A-26A for political reasons during operations in Thailand where bombers were restricted. So, no B. This poor aircraft. She must have spent some time on a therapist's couch saying, "I just don't know who I am." The new aircraft were deployed to Thailand in the attempt to disrupt supplies moving along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It is notable that 2 of these aircraft were even modified with a forward-looking infrared, that's FLIR, system under a project known as Operation Shed Light, which was a development project in aerial warfare initiated in 1966 by the USAF to increase the ability to accurately strike at night or in poor weather. But the tropical climate was found to have serious detrimental effects on the FLIR units, especially humidity, and this experiment was not to be put into widespread use, at least not at the time. The Counter-Invader served with USAF Air Commandos during the Vietnam War and the Secret War in Laos, flying low-level interdiction, close air support, and night attack missions until its military retirement in 1969. Many A-26s had a life after their military service. Some had their bomb bay doors sealed shut, passenger entry stairs added in the bomb bay, and the conversion of the fuselage to accept 6 to 8 passengers. They worked as executive personnel transports until the early 1960s when purpose-built executive aircraft like the turboprop Gulfstream were developed. A-26s were also modified as air tankers for forest fires, and they were called borate bombers after the retardant that was used for a time. Some of these firefighters worked right up until the 2000s. Because of their long civilian working lives, there are too many surviving Invader examples to even list, displayed, stored in, restoration, or even airworthy. I want to mention the two Invaders that can be seen at the U.S. Air Force Museum, as Tanner has provided a bunch of photos from her visits there, and you can see those on Patreon. Dream Girl is painted up to represent a B-26C version flown by the 34th Bomb Squadron during the Korean War night intruder missions. Built and delivered in March 1945 as an A-26C, it was destined for World War II but arrived too late to see combat. There is also a B-26K counter Invader from the Vietnam era. It was originally an A-26C, later converted to the K, and the counter Invader on display was one of the first 6 to arrive at Nakhon Phanom Royal Thai Air Force Base in 1966. In November 1980, it was flown to the museum. One surviving A-26, Charlie Golf Whiskey Lima Tango, was one of the last Invaders built by Douglas during the Second World War. After the war, it was used by the U.S. Navy as a gunnery target tug before being sold to Raytheon, who used it for testing radar and missile guidance systems. In 1974, the aircraft was purchased by Airspray Limited, a Red Deer, Alberta, Canada-based aerial firefighting service. Alongside 16 other sister A-26s, the aircraft worked with Airspray for 30 years, fighting fires in the Yukon until finally being retired in 2004. She has been restored and repainted for display at air shows, although don't get confused by the livery. The aircraft wears the colors of an F-86 Sabre of 439 Fighter Squadron RCAF, even though the RCAF never operated the A-26. Is this cheating? I don't know. In 2022, the aircraft was loaned long-term to the Royal Aviation Museum of Western Canada in Winnipeg, Manitoba. B-26 Invader November 167 Bravo, originally built as an A-26B with serial number 44-34602, rolled off the Douglas assembly line in 1944. Too late to see combat in World War II. Like many Invaders completed in the final months of the war, it likely remained in the United States, serving in training or reserve capacities. Following the war, the aircraft was redesignated as a B-26B when the newly independent U.S. Air Force adopted a unified designation system. Over the years, it transitioned from military service to civilian hands, ultimately restored and operated as a Warbird under the name Sugarland Express, as a nod to both its heritage and its later role as a flying piece of history. It's airworthy, and it's also for sale. If you've got $795,000 US kicking around. Lastly, I'm going to tell you of one other very special A-26B Invader, November X-ray 67834, aka the Reynolds Bombshell. This Invader was originally built as an A-26B, serial number 44-34759, when World War II wrapped up in 1945. This brand new Invader never saw military service. It went straight from Douglas to the U.S. surplus and was sold off to the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. But in 1947, pen-making magnate Milton Reynolds scooped it up and registered it as November X-ray 67834. It was stripped of its Warbird weight and outfitted with extra fuel tanks, and it then became the legendary Reynolds Bombshell. April 12th to 16th, 1947 saw pilot Bill Oden and navigator Tex Sally used this machine to smash Howard Hughes' round-the-world mark, flying roughly 20,000 miles in 78 hours, 55 minutes, and 56 seconds. Odom came back again in August for a solo flight, this time cutting the elapsed time to 73 hours, 5 minutes. From 1949 to 1954, she dove into oil field work with Phillips Drilling in San Antonio, Texas, and was converted into an executive transport by Slick Airways, complete with a 4-seat cabin. Later it served Slick Piedmont Airlines, carried through various private and corporate hands in Colorado under various registrations. By the late 1960s, Northrop in California had it, possibly for drone launch testing. It was fitted with pylons and fuel system reinforcements. Then in 1973, it found its way to Iran via a sale and into Bell Helicopters' custody at Tehran's Mehrahabad airport. In the late 1990s, it had supposedly been preserved and displayed at the Tehran Aerospace Exhibition Center, still wearing its USAF livery, but without military serials. So that's the full arc of the Reynolds bombshell. From brand new bomber to record-setting globe-trotting Warbird, then executive taxi, drone launch, testbed, and finally a museum piece in Tehran. A plane whose life spanned eras, and whose story is as layered as the history of aviation itself. So, at the time I'm recording this, the 12-day war between Iran and Israel has just wrapped up, where some IAF planes recently and publicly smashed up some old Iranian F-14 Tomcats. If that war ever heats up again, I would humbly request from the bottom of my Warbirder heart that the IAF not target the Reynolds bombshell. She's an aviation treasure. She's not hurting anyone, and she's more precious than any mangy old Tomcats. All right. Thanks again to all who support the podcast through Patreon. I appreciate it more than you know. You can check out lots of photos of what we've been talking about on the Patreon page. These are available to all. Why not join Patreon? There's a free option to join. And if you can't, well, just leave me a review or share me with your Warbird-loving friends. Until next time.